Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's, what day is it? It's Monday. It's Monday, June 24th, and it's 2024. And, oh, yeah, hey, some 24s in there. Great day for wasting your money on the lottery. But if you'd rather not do that, you can always waste your money by sending it to me here at Kagro in the morning. I beg you. I plead with you, please, to do that. I'm in the middle of the arduous task of, I don't know how I made it so difficult, trying to produce and get out there some new break begs, essentially, but some new material so that those of you who listen to the podcast later on in the afternoon and hear the insertion of the, hey, why not submit a story to us, or why not, submit your paycheck to us, or something like that, or remember to, like us on social media, where we do appear on social media, and it's not often these days, and we shy away from Facebook anyway, but we're there, and you can do that, or you can tell other people, just evangelize in general. I know that's a difficult thing to do. Hey, you have to listen to this podcast 2 hours a day, every day. Well, okay. Anyway, the point is you can come and go as you please, for one thing. But, I've been attempting I recorded a new piece for, hey, why not sign up for Patreon? And then I realized, I recorded it during the time when I was sounding a little funny when I had a cold. But then other people said, doesn't matter, doesn't sound any different, go ahead and use it. And then I realized it's actually quite difficult to, get the music that I need to sync up correctly so that the break jumps in and then exits at the right points in the intro, outro music. And then I realized nobody cares. But all right. Well, anyway, I'm very close to having new material for you to listen to for the next, 17 years or so. I really should just be producing these things more often and, winging it. And maybe I shouldn't worry so much about the music. But at any rate, it gives me an opportunity to thank Paul W., who just wrote me over the weekend to say that he was boosting his contribution, already existing Patreon contribution, boosted it. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's always something you should always be thinking about that. But if you bring in a friend, then you don't have to, you see. And anyway, I appreciate it very much. Just sort of nice to hear from people about what they enjoyed about the show. Paul had sent me a note that said that he laughed out loud, and at something that we said over, and he told me what it was, and that's something that I thought was going to do that but that's the fun of the show. And throwing in those asides and comments. What was it? It was that, oh yes, right. I was looking something up, must have been looking for the 12th Amendment. On Friday, was it? And I had grabbed my handy-dandy pocket copy of the Constitution, which was falling apart. And I said, my poor Constitution falling apart, both physically and metaphorically. And that was something that got a laugh and then got a nice note as well. And it's nice to hear that he's here at home when I'm on my own, even when occasionally the production staff are eating breakfast nearby. Let me tell you something. The thing about my in-house production staff, they not only don't care about the show, they actively dislike the show, which is a problem. But they're not supposed to be hanging on every word. And also, for the most part, no, they're not actually production staff, except for my son, who occasionally helps me look things up, and I actually give him, hey, find me an article about this, and that happens. But the production staff idea is a joke, and they do their best. It's my wife, and she does her best to ignore what's going on in the show. So it's nice to know that somebody else, heard the joke and appreciated it. All right, time for us to round up the news of the weekend. And if I remember correctly, and I'm relying on memory because I cannot find the note that says so, but I'm fairly certain I got past the note at some point, maybe during last Thursday's show. Maybe he even just said it on his way out the door, that Greg's busy this morning, but we'll be back on Wednesday, which is fine because I think there's a debate or something somewhere along the line. There's probably even some primaries on Tuesday. So, Wednesday's a good day for him to come back. But we are without the usual roundup, which means, I don't know, we're winging it. And talk about what happened over the weekend. I mostly spent my weekend, mostly, I guess, dehydrating. What were you doing? I wasn't, making dehydrated fruit or something fun or anything like that, but I was outside dehydrating, just becoming walking beef jerky if I could make it happen. It was 1,000 degrees in this area. We had the heat dome. We originally were on sort of the fringes of the heat dome, and then it moved down south and just sat over us. It wasn't the worst I've ever seen, quite honestly. It wasn't even the longest lasting I'd ever seen, but it was, 2 solid days of 100-degree temperatures. And then, of course, this place is a swamp, so 100 degrees is 106, 107. Not actually the worst humidity or heat indexes I've ever experienced. I imagine that would be down in, probably down in Bahamas when we took that vacation. Was it last year? It seems like decades ago. But yeah, they had some heat index it's 89 degrees. Oh, very pleasant. Okay, the heat index is 117. Oh, wow, that's quite unpleasant actually. But yeah, very hot. And of course, these were the days where they said, well, do everything you can to stay indoors. Don't go outside. Outdoors I went. All week, they're like, get outdoors. You should exercise. Spend some time outside the house. Go touch grass. Inside. Doing podcasts, editing, reading stuff, taking care of business inside the house, what have you. Running the household. Should get outside maybe for 15 minutes. And then I started listening to the bird things. All right, great. So now I'm like, well, now I got to spend my weekends out there. What if there's new birds I haven't heard yet? It's 115 degrees. Well, the birds are out there. I'll be okay too. I was all right. I drank lots of water, everything. I didn't get hurt or anything. It was just very hot. So hopefully you stayed cool. And we followed all the house cooling tips and closed the blinds and tried to keep the air conditioner running, but on an even keel so that we weren't blasting it at any point. Good tip I saw from somebody the other day was putting fans on the stairs to the basement, if you have a basement. I mean, we don't have an actual underground basement, but the lowest floor of the house is, in fact, quite considerably cooler than the rest of the house if you're not doing anything in particular to move that air around. Put some fans on it, blow the cool air up the stairs. I think that helped a little bit. It's a little noisy, but, Anyway, let's see what your cooling tips were and whether you have anything you want to share with anybody else. There's always room for that. Hell, if you want to, you can record a segment about all the fun things that you did in order to keep yourself cool over the weekend. And I will tell you all the things that you need to know to be extremely uncool at the end of the weekend. All right, all the nerdy politics stuff. There's things we put away in pocket. There are things that Justice has been hinting at on our way through the morning intros. It's a little quieter here than usual on a Monday in the background because the production staff, including College Boy number 2, out of the house this morning. A little dental surgery this morning. So, I'm a little distracted, and they'll probably come in on the way in the middle of the show, come in and lay down and take their recovery. So we'll be working on all of that. Let's see. Other things that we need to catch up on. Yeah, it's debate week. Trump spent the weekend, I guess expectations setting, but it's been real interesting. It's quite an adventure for him. The expectations that I guess you would come away with if you were a Trump fan is, well, Sleepy Joe, who's totally out of it and has dementia, won't be able to debate worth a damn. And then they realize, okay, if we're really going to go through with this debate, we need to lower expectations for our guy, for Trump. And so the story needs to be, no. Joe Biden, for whatever reason, this is where we'll have to do the spinning. Joe Biden is a debating machine. He's going to wipe the floor with Donald Trump. So we need to be able to explain that to people. So obviously the explanation is, well, he's going to be all hopped up on goofballs. He keeps saying he's going to get a shot in the ass. He's going to get all kinds of drugs. He's going to be on drugs to win the debate. So that if he does, in fact, mop the floor with Donald Trump, they will just point to it and say, well, he's a huge, huge drug user, which I didn't even think was a problem. That should, interestingly, I guess for Donald Trump, I don't know, this never occurred to him, of course, and who cares whether it occurs to him or not? It's not really based in reality anyway. But, he's been running around saying maybe his advisors tell him, you're going to do fine. First of all, not just in the debate, but in the election. Yes, you've been convicted on 34 criminal counts. That's true. You are a convicted felon, and they will keep saying that. But, that just means that you can connect with a whole new demographic of voter. You should be appealing to minorities. Wink, wink. One particular minority in general. And say, well, now we have a common experience. So many Black Americans, and when I say that, I mean Black Americans, not black or blah Americans, as Rick Santorum said. I don't know. I hesitated there for a second, but the idea in mind that they have in mind is, well, lots of you hear lots of valid complaints, although maybe they think they're not valid complaints, about over-policing and over-incarceration, and particularly among the Black community. And so I'm on their side now. I can understand them, and they can understand me. I, too, have been wrongly convicted. And he's actually gone out there and campaigned on my criminal convictions makes me closer to the Black community, which is, I would think, actually a little insulting, but I don't know. I don't know how it's been taken. Probably most people didn't even notice, because the hell would you be spending your time listening to Donald Trump for? But I guess he can continue to do that, and I guess he can now say, well, not only have I been convicted, but where the hell were we going with this? I can't even remember now. But yeah, at any rate, it's just, you know what? I completely lost my train of thought because I was so astonished, reminding myself what he had said about his convictions and how he was trying to play it off. But, anyway, where were we with all of this? Yes, I don't know. So we don't know where we were going with it. That's odd. But anyway, now he'll be accusing Joe Biden of being on drugs for the debate, and the whole thing is rigged anyway, and yada, yada. But I wonder if that thought will occur to me again. I wonder if any of you remember where I was going with that, and you can tell me. Anyway, all right, let's see. Much better for me to stop wandering and get to things that are in pocket and that I can share with you, where the thoughts are all organized and everything like that. There's plenty to go with. Let's see. Here's something that I saw this morning that I thought this was the ultimate Republican grift. Although, quite honestly, I would take this job too. Though not for Republicans, but if it were somehow offered on the Democratic side, this is a dream job this guy has rigged up for himself. Of course, the real story is that this would never be offered as a job on the Democratic side, and I think you'll see why in a moment. And if you don't, I'll preview it for you. It pays him money, and a considerable sum at that. So that's not happening on the Democratic side. It just doesn't. They don't invest in things like this. Anyway, this story from the AP circulating this morning on social media. Conservative-backed group is creating a list of federal workers it suspects could resist Trump plans. Now, they would resist Trump plans because they were illegal, unconstitutional, terrible ideas in general, Hitlerific in their implications, etc. And here's the story. It's illustrated by another picture of a white Republican guy that looks like a thumb with a beard. And here he is. And this time it's Tom Jones, not the entertainer Tom Jones, but of course the other generic white guy, Tom Jones. There's 750 million of those, but this one is a political activist, apparently. That's slang for unemployed former legislative aide, I guess. And here it is. A political activist and former Capitol Hill aide to Republican senators. He is pictured here, I guess, in his hometown of Bardstown, Kentucky. And that's probably one of the reasons he's no longer working on Capitol Hill. The commute is murder. I don't know. Anyway, he's working from his home office in small town, Kentucky. And how is he making ends meet? And the short answer is essentially this, and then I'll give you the details. Sometimes I like to do it the other way around. The short answer is, I'll tell you what, I was a Republican aide I was an aide to Republican senators, so I know something about politics, and in general, probably whatever his legislative portfolio was, I don't know. But he got, I'm sure, some experience in understanding who and from what positions in the bureaucracy and the Biden administration, from what places and which people were pushing back on Republican policy fever dreams. What your wish list? Why can't we implement our federal policy wish list? And of course, the answer actually is you don't hold the majority in the Senate. You have a bare majority in the House. You haven't passed any legislation to speak of. And if you did, there's always the chance that Joe Biden would veto it. And so, no, there aren't going to be a lot of federal bureaucrats interested in implementing your designs. But they're also worried that in a Trump administration, where they would totally have the majority in both houses of Congress because reasons, the deep state, in other words, this is another name for the deep state, and the deep state would oppose our agenda. Who are these deep staters, and where can we find them for summary execution is basically what the conservatives would like to know. And the ultimate grift here is this guy said, either by choice or by necessity, I'm going home to Bardstown, Kentucky. No more being an aide to Republican senators for me. No more Jell-O for me, Ma. I'm going back to Bardstown. Or I got fired and I'm going back to Bardstown. Or maybe I was a district or in-state legislative aide for one of the Kentucky senators. I don't know. We'll see if we can figure out the background. But the idea here is, remember I said it was going to make a long story short here. Oh, well, that's out the window. The basics of it are, he said, let me tell you what I'd like to do from my home office. I will compile a list on a blog. Like, nobody will supervise me, nothing. I just post when I post. I'm going to make a list of the top 100 people I hate the most in the bureaucracy, who I think, the justification is these are people who will stand in the way of the Trump agenda, and we should use our Schedule F powers and what have you to get rid of these people. Well, you want to implement Project 2025? This is a Project 2025 related issue. I'll tell you the top 100 bureaucrats you need to target to get out of government so that you can do your Project 2025 thing. The 100 people I hate the most. And you will pay me $100,000 to do it over the course of this summer, because I have to get ready for the administration coming in, of course, at the end of the summer when they're elected in a transition period between November and January is what they're anticipating, of course. So for the summer, I'm going to post a list of 100 poop heads that I hate a whole lot. And you pay me $1,000 a name. Deal? Like, what? If I could have gotten $1,000 for the whole month out of a Democratic, interest group or lobbying group or PAC or what have you. And I mean, I think the money here is coming from the Heritage Foundation. But, if you could wring $1,000 for a whole month's work out of one of these Democratic organizations, that was astounding. This guy's going to get $1,000 per name. $100,000. Your job is identify 100 bureaucrats who should get fired. And I'm sure to him it doesn't matter what happens to the people. He's just going to be getting paid. It's like the dream grift for these guys. Here's the way Lisa Mascaro of the AP has written it up. From his home office in a small town in Kentucky, in small town Kentucky. She's got a style here, I ruined it by reading it wrong. From his home office in small town Kentucky. And try this in a small town. You can, because all you need is an internet connection. By the way, how come small town Kentucky has such a robust internet connection? Well, something, I hate government. Anyway, a seasoned political operative is quietly investigating scores of federal employees suspected of being hostile to the policies of Republican Donald Trump, who, by the way, is not president of the United States and doesn't look like he's going to be president of the United States. So what would it matter? They're also hostile to the powers of Francisco Franco, who is, by the way, still dead. Trump, also in many ways dead. Not the most important one, but, that day is coming. I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying it comes for all of us. And Donald Trump, presumably further down the path on that than the rest of us. Anyway, They're hostile. He's suspected, anyway, these people are suspected of being hostile to the policies of Republican Donald Trump, an effort that dovetails with the broader conservative preparations for a new White House, which, may or may not be necessary. But Tom Jones and his American Accountability Foundation are digging into the backgrounds. Why call himself the American Accountability Foundation? Tax purposes and for other organizational purposes. You could mail checks to Tom Jones's house in small town Kentucky, but instead, what if you mailed them to a foundation that he could use to claim that it was tax exempt, but could pay himself a big salary? And if you were worried about offices, don't worry about it. We're not going to send it to his home office. He says he works in his home office, but you're going to send that check to a box at a UPS store. And something, it's going to look like it's a real foundation and everything. Tom Jones and his American Accountability Foundation are digging into the background, social media posts, and commentary of key high-ranking government employees, starting with the Department of Homeland Security, which is never a problem and poses no national security risks whatsoever. And just, as long as we're talking about political union with Russia to own the globalists, yes, it's true. These private citizens will be spending their summer earning $100,000, giving the names of people that, Russia, if you're listening, these people should fall out a window before the next Trump administration, and whatever. Anyway, the Department of Homeland Security, of course, would be tasked with looking into this, and they would catch Tom Jones and execute him as a spy in a normal situation. But what if he had them killed first? Well, anyway, they're relying in part on tips from his network of conservative contacts. Hey, guys, is there anybody you want to put on this list? Anyway, so his network of conservative contacts, including workers. Woo, how about that? Now, that's what sets him apart. This is a conservative activist who knows, quote unquote, workers. So that's really something. The workers, of course, are the disgruntled subordinates of these people who are going to be put on the death list. Anyway, in a move that alarms some, but not others, because both sides, they're preparing to publish the findings online, which never leads to anything bad. With a $100,000 grant, it's hard to believe that there's other paragraphs before this, because this is the real news. With a $100,000 grant from the influential Heritage Foundation. And remember, it's not hate, it's heritage. The goal is to post 100 names of government workers to a website this summer to show a potential new administration who might be standing in the way of a second-term Trump agenda and ripe for scrutiny, reclassification, reassignments, or firings. But, do you see just how low-hanging the fruit here is? Like, how can I earn this $100,000, you might say? Well, why don't you publish a blog and put the names of 100 government workers on it? Well, there's thousands of government workers. Hundreds, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds, hundreds of thousands of government workers. Does it matter to you? No, we'll pay you the $100,000 regardless. Just so long as you give us names that, if a bunch of them look like people will cheer if we tell everybody who they are, what they do, what they have done, and that we're getting rid of them, that will be enough for us. So, give me 100 names and just, do I have to fly to Washington, D.C. and give it to you? Do you have to present a report? Do I have to do an oral report? This is terrible. I have all kinds of anxiety about that. No, put it on a blog. Hey. All right. And you're saying $100,000. Okay. Let's see if I can make that work for you. That's true. We need to understand who these people are and what they do, said Jones, a former Capitol Hill aide to Republican senators. So yeah, he's back in Bardstown, Kentucky from Washington, D.C. He's had his fill of life in the big city, and he's back home. We need to understand who these people are and what they do. Yeah. Well, if you want to be president, sure. Yeah, if you want to just, rile people up or get some death threats made or actually murder some people, maybe it's important. I guess so. I think they'll probably ask not only just for a list of names, but for write-ups on each of these people. So you could, if you were feeling guilty about taking the $100,000, which you would not be. But if you were, you could say, all right, well, I'll write a paragraph about each of these people, and I'm going to have to go on the internet and Google them. So it's worth the money. The concept of compiling and publicizing a list of government employees shows, that it's Hitlerian, it's Stalinistic. But here's what we say about it in the AP. It shows the lengths Trump's allies are willing to go to ensure nothing or no one will block his plans in a potential second term. That's a mild way of putting it. Jones's Project Sovereignty 2025. How do you like that one? There's Project 2025 and Project Sovereignty 2025. And remember, this is not domestic terrorism, it's sovereignty. And it comes as Heritage Projects 2025 lays the groundwork with policies, proposal, and personnel ready for a possible new White House. But Project Sovereignty is, project execution of the previous regime and making sure that nobody who is a civil servant who might get in the way or just basically say, hey, this might require some additional thought is still around. The effort focused on top career government officials who aren't appointees within the political structure has stunned democracy experts and shocked the civil service community in what they compare with the Red Scare of mid-century McCarthyism. And it's a good comparison. Oh, and I'm a couple of seconds late on the music already. Things are getting screwed up. Jacqueline Simon, policy director at the American Federation of Government Employees, said the language being used, the Heritage Foundation's announcement, praised the group, for ferreting out anti-American bad actors is shocking. And it is. And they love to shock you, and so that's what they're going to do, and they'll come up with the worst possible language to get publicity. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time, just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. Alrighty, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And it occurs to me we are still searching mentally for what was I talking about when I lost my train of thought earlier on in the show. I still haven't really recovered from that one, but alright, like I said, my mind is elsewhere. And so we rely on the organized thoughts of those who have set them to digital paper beforehand. And it's that much easier to read the script. Where were we with this one? Yes. Civil servants or the policy director for the AFGE, American Federation of Government Employees, reminding us that the language being used in this new thing, Project Sovereignty 2025, the language was alarming. The Heritage Foundation's announcement saying that they would be ferreting out anti-American bad actors. That is, people who have policy differences with somebody who's not even president right now, by the way, and isn't president because he's extraordinarily unpopular, never been popular, never had more than 50% support while he was in office or while he was seeking to regain office. And These people are, of course, executing the policy of the actual president of the United States currently, right now, and largely will do the same later as well, but something, they're not extreme enough for us, and so that makes them anti-American. Civil servants, to get back to the article, are often ex-military personnel and are required. I mean, that's true, but it's not true in the main. It doesn't really mean anything. Let me see where they're going with this paragraph. They're often ex-military personnel, sure, and are required to take an oath to the Constitution to work for the federal government. I mean, that's true whether or not they're ex-military. Not a loyalty test to a president, a particular one, in the White House, she and others said. That's true. And there are, by the way, more often these days than in the past, ex-military personnel, because there are programs that make it easier for ex-military, when they transition out of the military, they get some hiring preference in moving into federal government civilian employment, which seems fair enough. But I mean, I guess here serves as a reminder of like, okay, you understand what it is to serve the country under oath in a nonpartisan fashion, assuming you actually did a good job of that while you were in the military. Not everyone does, but in the main, yes. And I guess really she's just trying to point out here that, these are people who actually have been lifelong, career-long servants of the country in one way or another. And, of course, to declare them un-American somehow because they want to actually say, execute the law as currently written. Of course, the Trump administration plans to change all of that, too. But, who are actually dedicated to the constitutional system of supposedly nonpartisan government. And I don't know. Anyway, I guess that's supposed to mean that it's particularly terrible to threaten them with execution as being anti-American. Because after all the rest of you who are just regular American people who went about your lives and just tried to do the best you could for yourselves and your fellow citizens, you might actually be anti-American. But the ones who came from the military certainly are not, because reasons. I don't know. She didn't actually intend for you to understand that she was saying such a thing, but that is the subtext of what gets said very often about things like this. Anyway, she continues on and says, it just seems as though their goal is to try to menace federal employees and sow fear. That is absolutely the goal here. This is, again, Simon. Who's Simon? It is Jacqueline Simon. And Simon says this about what they're doing. They're trying to menace federal employees and sow fear, says Simon, whose union backs President Joe Biden, by the way, a Democrat. Did you realize this? Thank you, AP. For re-election. As Trump, who has been convicted of felony charges, again, I'll thank you once more, AP, thank you for saying so, in a hush money case, not really what it was, and is under a 4-count federal indictment accusing him of working to overturn his 2020 election loss and, stealing national security documents and maybe trying to sell them to foreign individuals, faces a likely rematch with Biden this fall. Far-right conservatives have vowed to take a wrecking ball to what they call the deep state bureaucracy. The Trump campaign has said outside groups don't speak for the president, who alone sets his policy priorities, which is his way. This is essentially the built-in Rush Limbaugh dodge. It was a joke. I'm joking. You liberals can't take a joke. If he doesn't say it, it's not attributable to the Trump campaign or administration. And if he does say it, you're supposed to what? Take it seriously, but not literally or something. Basically, I mean, this is exactly the sort of wall of defense you would have to build up if your candidate was a rambling idiot before he became a demented, doddering old fool. But, okay, sure. Unless he says it, it's not real. And if he does say it, it's also maybe not real. But, how else could you construct a campaign around somebody like this? Anyway, so this is meant to deflect attention and questions. So if you ask the Trump campaign, what about this Project Sovereignty 2025 thing? It's an outside group. Can't answer it. Sorry. I mean, they're not supposed to be coordinating, so there is that. The Trump campaign has said outside groups, right, don't speak for the president. Conservatives, though, view the federal workforce as overstepping its role to become a power center that can drive or thwart a president's agenda. Particularly during the Trump administration, government officials came under attack from the White House and Republicans on Capitol Hill as his own cabinet often raised objections to some of his more singular or even unlawful proposals. Or maybe people who were public health experts said, no, it's not actually a good idea to try to inject disinfectant somehow into the body, or the various other stupid plans, or to drink the water of your fish tank in order to get hydroxychloroquine, which doesn't actually work against this disease and certainly wouldn't work in fish tank tablet form. And don't take horse medicine and don't take fish medicine. They're approved for use in horses and fish for a reason. Science and the manufacture of these drugs was such that these are made for these other kinds of organisms, and maybe you shouldn't be eating them. And however, that's now anti-American and thwarting his agenda. Anyway, while Jones's group won't necessarily be recommending whether to fire or reassign the federal workers it lists, wink, or, reassign them to a different floor of the building, just not using the stairs or the elevator. Windows will be fine. The work aligns with Heritage's far-reaching Project 2025 blueprint for a conservative administration, to the extent that it is conservative to, either slander them in toto or murder them as you see fit. It's extremely conservative, just abandoning the entire civil service system that we've had in place for 75 years and replacing it with, well, I guess it's conservative in the sense that you go back to the old spoils system, but, whatever. So Heritage's Project 2025, about it, proposes reviving the Trump Schedule F policy that would try to reclassify tens of thousands of federal workers as political appointees, which could enable mass dismissals, although a Biden administration rule seeks to make that more difficult. The Heritage Project is working to recruit and train a new generation to travel to Washington to fill government jobs. And in order to do this, they have enlisted the guy who has traveled from Washington to Kentucky for some reason. You know about this, right? Nope. Not really. Well, how about $100,000? Oh, then I know about it. Yes, absolutely. In announcing the $100,000 Innovation Award last month. What's the innovation here? Here is a blog list of people I hate. That is not even innovative, quite frankly, but let alone it being worth $100,000. But here it is. Heritage said it would support American Accountability Foundation's investigative researchers, in-depth reports, and educational efforts to alert Congress, a conservative administration, and the American people to the presence of anti-American bad actors burrowed into the administrative state and ensure appropriate action is taken. That is some grandiose language, and dangerous, of course, but, in describing, essentially I'm going to put 100 names on a blog. Heritage President Kevin Roberts, who, by rights probably ought to be fired for authorizing this grant, said the weaponization of the federal government, remember weaponization? Maybe we should go back to that essay about that. The weaponization of the federal government has been possible only because of the deep state entrenched leftist bureaucrats. There's no other possibility for weaponizing the federal government. He said he was proud to support the work of the American Accountability Foundation workers, if there are any, in their fight to hold our government accountable and drain it of bad actors, like, draining the swamp. The federal government employs about 2.2 million people. There's the answer to that question, including those in Washington, D.C., in the Washington, D.C. area, and workers whose unions say many Americans know as friends or neighbors in communities across the country. Yeah, because there's federal workers everywhere. It's the federal government. It covers the whole place. About 4,000 positions in the government are considered political appointees who routinely change from one presidential administration to the next, but most are career professionals, from landscapers at Veterans Administration cemeteries, to economists at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The public list-making conjures for some, that is really for everyone, the era of Joseph McCarthy. What they mean is, well, let me finish this sentence. The public list-making conjures for some the era of Joseph McCarthy, the senator who conducted grueling hearings into suspected communist sympathizers during the Cold War. The hearings were orchestrated by a top staffer, Roy Cohn, who became a confidant of a younger Trump. That is a good point and worth noting. About the language at the top of the paragraph here, the public list-making conjures for some the era of Joseph McCarthy. As I said, it conjures for everyone the era of Joseph McCarthy. What they mean is, what's being winked at here is that for some that is a bad connection. Oh no, the era of Joseph McCarthy, when conservative witch hunting and overreach created an atmosphere of fear and loathing and tensions between Americans and endangered the lives and livelihoods of thousands of ordinary American citizens. And for some, the conjuring of the era of Joseph McCarthy is a cause for celebration. Huzzah! We are bringing back the era of Joseph McCarthy. I think that's the new hotness now, is to say Joseph McCarthy was right, and we should be hunting down Americans whom we hate because of politics and drumming them out of public life and possibly listing them for assassination. Sky, S-K-Y-E. I was like S-Y-K-E. That's some name. Psyche. Is that a new spelling of psyche? Is that name coming back into fashion? No. But Sky, and which is an old spelling of Sky. Sky Perryman, CEO of the advocacy group Democracy Forward, who, by the way, is getting $100,000 from no one, I'm sure. Well, grant-wise, anyway. Who knows what they pay the CEO of the advocacy group Democracy Forward? Well, I don't know who funds it. I don't know. Anyway, Sky said it's deeply disturbing and reminiscent of the darker parts of American history. That's true. I could have told you that. I did tell you that, but I didn't. No one called me on the phone to ask me. Publicly naming government workers is an intimidation tactic to try to chill the work of these civil servants, she said, and part of a broader retribution agenda underway this election. They're seeking to undermine our democracy, she said. They're seeking to undermine the way that our government works for people. I wonder if I could find something. Well, it's not time to do that now, but I'm curious about the Democracy Forward group and who it is and what they do, and I'm sort of curious about that. Here's the page. I mean, is it a large group? Will it be a very large fine they'll have to pay? I don't know. Oh, there's Sky Perryman, and our team is very prominently displayed here. Do we know any of these people? No, but it's a large team, so that's good. And, well, I don't know. They work somewhere and do something. That's a lot of people drawing probably all pretty good salaries. And honestly, yeah, they may be, that's big enough certainly to be working off more than $100,000 worth of grant money. Each one of these people is probably making $100,000. So, all right. I guess you could say we're taking it back in terms of, so there's always been lots of people making lots of money working in Democratic political activism. It's true. There's just a lack of expansion outside of the circle, and there's not a lot of grant making to grassroots activist types who, will take care of work like this. They'll send another $100,000 to this group and ask that someone in-house compile such a list. But really, what's the difference? I mean, I don't know. I guess it's worse, but there's definitely a lot of discussion among Democratic activists who seek that kind of support and never find it. Who say I think it's just difficult to crack the code there and to get a $100,000 grant to move outside of the same circles of established Democratic groups that pass the money around among themselves, and have it make it outside to grassroots activists. It's just notoriously difficult among Democratic activists, and these days notoriously easy, it looks like, even without any, discernible product among Republican ranks. And maybe it's just that maybe they just do a better job at advertising and doing PR for the new groups that they just create out of thin air. I mean, they are going through the exercise of building a organizational cover. I mean, it could just be sending money to Tom Jones, but instead they're sending it to, what did they call his, American Institute for God knows what. American Accountability Foundation, that's it. So, I don't know, maybe it's just taking a different form. Maybe we're overly critical of the way Democratic activists distribute their money, and it's just as closed a system as this is. He's being billed as, working out of his home office in small town Kentucky, but he was working for Republican senators in Washington, D.C., so he's as much as part of their circle as anybody else. They said, move out of Washington, go back to Bardstown, Kentucky, so you can look like a grassroots activist and make Democrats and Democratic activists jealous, I guess. And then they'll obsess about our thing, and then they'll talk about it for 2 hours. Oh, it's working. Shoot. Well, anyway, let's get done with this piece here and see if there's anything else that we can poke fun at while we, bite our nails about what they're trying to do. Let's see. So here we are. They're seeking to undermine our democracy. That's absolutely true. Thank you, Sky, for pointing that out. Jones, from his desk overlooking rick houses storing barrels in the bourbon capital of Bardstown, that's what it says, scoffed at comparisons to McCarthyism as nonsense, but he should in fact be embracing it as true, and his team will love it. But whatever. He got the memo that it was bad. Well, who is he? He's a former staffer to then Senator Jim DeMint, so it's been some time since he worked on Capitol Hill. The South Carolina conservative Republican who later led Heritage and now helms the Conservative Policy Institute, where American Accountability Foundation has a mailing address. So there's your answer, what they're using for their mailing address. Are you a real foundation? Do you have offices and a team? No. Where can we reach you by mail to send you $100,000? Send it to the Conservative Policy Institute. What's that? It's the place where Jim DeMint, who you guys at Heritage Foundation hired and then fired, is now working. Now, why they didn't say, I'm not sending $100,000 to a group organized by the guy we had to drum out because he was so stupid and ineffective at the Heritage Foundation, but I guess they are, and I guess that makes you think, well, maybe it wasn't that they thought he was so terrible. It's just that, I don't know, he landed in hot water because he ran his mouth, and we'll just go get somebody else who won't run their mouth quite like this, and we'll keep him on the payroll. So, Jim DeMint, how long has it been since he's been in the Senate, too? I'm just curious. Let's look it up and take a look at his Wikipedia, and that will give us, there we are. So it's been a long time since he was even president of the Heritage Foundation. He was a senator last in up through 2012, and then he was out in January of 2013 when his term ended. So it's been, let's say 2012, 12 years plus since he was a senator, which means that if Tom Jones is a former, I'm a former Capitol Hill aide too. It's been even longer since I was there, but it's been 12 years since the guy he worked for was even a senator. Interesting that, does that mean he moved, it took him 12 years to get a hold of this $100,000 grant, or was he an aide to other Republican senators in between now and then, but he wants to be associated with Jim DeMint and so doesn't divulge the rest of his connections? Just sort of curious. Let's see. It's all right here. What do you know? He's a former staffer to then Senator Jim DeMint. And, right, DeMint's, by the way, been out of the Heritage Foundation since 2017. So that, too, quite a while already. Let's see. And then he went to the Conservative Policy Institute, where American Accountability Foundation has a mailing address. Jones also worked for Senator Ron Johnson, there we go, and provided opposition research for Texas GOP Senator Ted Cruz's 2016 presidential bid. So working for other members as well, including people who ran against Trump, but now, yay, Trump. And here's my assassination list for you, sir, with tears streaming down my eyes. With 6 researchers, Jones's team operates remotely across the country. In other words, once again, stay home, we'll blog, and then we get $100,000. So they are operating remotely across the country, poring over the information about federal workers within Homeland Security, the State Department, and other agencies. I wonder how they find out about these agencies. How many of them are there anyway? That deal with immigration and border issues. That's where they're mostly mad. Their focus is on the highest ranks of the civil servants, GS-13, GS-14, and GS-15. Woo! Employees and those in senior executive positions, even higher ranking than them, who could put up roadblocks to Trump's plans for tighter borders and more deportations. I think it's important to the next administration to understand who these people are, Jones said. He dismissed the risks that could be involved in publicly posting the names, salary information, and other details of federal workers who have some level of privacy, or the idea that his group's work could put employees' livelihoods in jeopardy, or actually their lives. You don't get to make policy and then say, hey, don't scrutinize me, he said. There you go. So there's the answer. He acknowledges some of the work is often a gut check or instinct about which federal employees would be suspected of trying to block a conservative agenda. How do you justify the $100,000? I got instincts. Anyway, we're looking at, are there wrong people on the bus right now that are, openly hostile to efforts to secure the southern border, he said. Why are they on the bus? Well, because we intend to throw them under the bus. How about, it could be any other metaphor, but they chose bus for a reason. His own group came under scrutiny. Did you know that? As it first probed Biden nominees. Biden had repealed Trump's Schedule F executive order in January of 2021, but a Government Accountability Office report in 2022 found that agencies believed it could be reinstated by a future administration. Sure. Since then, the Biden administration issued a rule that would make it harder to fire workers. A new administration could direct the Office of Personnel Management to undo the regulation, but the process would take time and be open to legal challenges. But then again, they're also saying that perhaps the head of the Office of Personnel Management would once again be Russell Vought, and he doesn't care about legal anything. So, they could just short-circuit the whole thing that way. But Russell Vought is holding out for White House Chief of Staff, so he might not be there to direct the undoing of the Biden administration rule. But he would issue instructions to someone else to take care of it, I am sure. Okay, let's see. Plenty of other things to take a look at, including, let's see. Oh, well, we should probably get this one on the record, don't you think? Maybe right before our break. We head back to Michigan, because all the fun things are happening in Michigan these days. And you probably saw this one just before the weekend, and we didn't squeeze it in on Friday, so you probably heard about it over the weekend, if not on Friday itself. Michigan lawmaker faces sex assault investigation after 3 a.m. arrest. Just kind of a fun one. Police recommended multiple felony charges, including assault and a weapons offense against Republican State Representative Neil Frisk. So another member of the Republican squad joining the ranks here. And here's the basic story. Washington Post covering this one. Kim Bellware, a conservative state lawmaker in Michigan, family values, etc., is facing a sexual assault investigation after he was arrested just before 3 a.m. on Thursday in Lansing. That, of course, being the capital. He was, I guess, at work. The Lansing Police Department on Friday requested felony charges of sexual assault, and a weapons offense against Representative Neil Frisk, a 62-year-old Republican, young man making the mistakes of youth, representing parts of northern Michigan, who is seeking re-election this year, of course. Frisk did not immediately respond to a request for comment on Friday. He had not formally been charged as of Friday afternoon. But according to the office of Ingham County Prosecutor John J. DeWayne, who's a Democrat, an investigation is ongoing into the late-night incident, which began when police responded to reports of a man with a gun and possible shots fired. During the course of the initial investigation, law enforcement officers learned, I love the language here, of a possible sexual assault and an adult female they arrested a 62-year-old male, Cornelius Frisk, with a K, by the way, Cornelius Frisk, DeWayne's office said, using the lawmaker's full first name. How does he go? Neil Frisk. Cornelius. Get it? Okay. Interesting. Police arrested Frisk around 2:45 a.m., and they frisked him, of course, Thursday, and took him into custody. The block where police said Frisk was arrested is where he purchased a condo in January, according to property records. The lawmaker was released Friday, hours after Frisk's early morning arrest on Thursday. His campaign defended him in a statement, writing, you ready for this one? As many of us know, Representative Frisk is always exercising his Second Amendment right. That is to say, chasing women around with guns and possibly firing shots at them. They're not 100% sure somehow yet whether or not he fired shots. I mean, you can figure that out, but it's an ongoing investigation. But that's some answer. Well, he was exercising his Second Amendment right. Well, the Second Amendment right is to bear the arms, not necessarily to chase people around the neighborhood at 3 a.m. and possibly shoot at them. And they haven't even gotten to who is this woman yet. But it's in here. In his statement, Frisk's campaign cast the arrest as suspicious due to the forthcoming release of absentee ballots for Michigan's August 6th primary. Why that date is so critical, I have no idea. But, well, the ballots are about to come out. So obviously they would. The deep state is going to fake arrest him. That's not suspicious at all. The campaign also accused Frisk's opponent of having deep state ties, but did not specify whether it was referencing his Republican primary challenger or the Democrat vying to represent Michigan's 107th district. Parker Fairbairn. Bain. That's F-A-I-R, Fair. B-A-I-R-N. Fairbairn. I don't know. Frisk's Republican primary challenger, by the way, in a statement Friday said Frisk deserves the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, but called the Assemblyman's voting record abysmal and immoral. For that, no. He doesn't get the presumption of innocence. Neil deserves his time in court, and the people of the 107th deserve better than Neil, Fairbairn said. As a member of the conservative Michigan House Freedom Caucus, they've got one there too. Frisk has supported hardline immigration policies. Of course, those people have to be arrested, but not me. And introduced legislation to curb abortion access, including an unsuccessful bill that would have banned the use of prescription pills for medication-induced abortion. By the way, we haven't even gotten to this here. And it looks like the article actually concludes without making any mention of this. This is astonishing, because what made this story so interesting in the first place was, oh, the woman was a stripper. What? Be right back. Okay, welcome back, everybody, to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So, upside down world, we now turn to Fox News for the other information that was somehow, I don't know why, left out of the Washington Post report. Cop, Michigan rep, accused of chasing an exotic dancer while brandishing a gun. Ah, yes. This is the story of Neil Frisk as told by Christina Coulter of Fox News. Let's see, we'll just skip down and see if we can't find something that is different from what we had already understood to be the case. He's 62 years old. That was confirmed again by both Fox News and the Detroit Free Press, whom they're quoting for that information. Frisk allegedly chased an adult dancer after a disagreement. MIRS News. Michigan something, I guess, but what is MIRS News? Have we been there before? Oh, well, this is a Twitter comment from MIRS News, which is the Michigan Information and Research Service. Michigan's, as they say, they're Michigan's leader in providing capital news coverage. Well, anyway, okay, so he allegedly chased an adult dancer after a disagreement. And somehow this disagreement resulted in his being charged with sexual assault. So, no means no. Oh, well, I say no means yes. That's the disagreement, I guess, maybe, in this sexual assault charge. Well, at any rate, chased her with a gun, possible shots fired, just as the others have reported. He was arrested on Windbreak Lane, near a condo he owns in Lansing. The dancer reportedly worked anyway, at the nearby Deja Vu Showgirls Strip Club, according to the outlet, which is the closest such club. So extremely convenient. That is excellent. We should map on Google Maps. How walkable is the neighborhood? Can you walk from his condo on Windbreak Lane to Deja Vu Showgirls? Did they need to be driving? I don't know. But anyway, it's a good place, I guess, to brandish weapons and run around at 3 o'clock in the morning in situations like this. On the scene, law enforcement learned of a possible sexual assault of an adult female. The office of the Ingham County prosecutor, John DeWayne, told the Free Press. And from there on, I guess the story is more or less the same with a few extra details, like the names of the spokespeople. But yeah, the real winner, I thought, from the Washington Post coverage was, there's a Second Amendment, and you get to run around with guns in and around the environs of the strip clubs. Okay, well, everybody's home. Feeling all right? Okay, that's about what I expected. Got a mouthful of cotton. So, all right, all on the mend here. So I know a lot of people were worried and concerned for you. Okay. Well, while that takes place in the background, I just we'll jump off of that and keep an eye on the story of Neil Frisk and his Second Amendment rights. Speaking of Second Amendment rights, of course, there was just a big Supreme Court decision which struck all the observers as weird because it was walking back. It apparently looked to all the observers like they were walking back a decision which they had left to Clarence Thomas to write in a previous case, and that everybody basically came away saying, yeah, actually, that's a stupid thing, this whole idea of, well, we need to look to historical precedent, not legal precedent, but historical precedent in order to establish rights across 250 years in this country. And we should be defining gun rights in terms of what we, 250 years later, think they meant 250 years earlier about how they would have regarded AR-15s and independent militias roaming the woods of the United States preparing to overthrow the federal government. Well, that seems unusual, to say the least. But so it wasn't entirely clear what they were talking about. But now we have a couple of pieces that analyze what's going on, which I'll read in, I guess, we'll go back to the earliest one. But I think between these three pieces, we should be able to discover some really interesting views of what's happening here inside the court. The first one being from Mark Joseph Stern at Slate, who's a frequent source of good analytical material about what's happening on the Supreme Court. And here, the Supreme Court walks back Clarence Thomas's guns extremism. He told us at the end of last week, the Supreme Court upheld a federal law disarming domestic abusers on Friday. Remember that was the basis of the ruling in the Rahimi case? I think so. And I mean, we may have to look at this, by the way, in the pocket version, because I'm hitting the paywall here. But the Supreme Court upheld a federal law disarming domestic abusers on Friday, significantly narrowing a radical 2022 precedent in its process. So this stain has been on the Constitution for some 2 years at this point. But this time around, an 8-1 ruling in the U.S. versus Rahimi is a major victory for gun safety laws, as a much needed reprieve after 2 years of unceasing hostility from the federal judiciary. Chief Justice John Roberts' majority opinion here walked back maximalist rhetoric recklessly injected into the law by Justice Clarence Thomas that had imperiled virtually every modern regulation limiting access to firearms. Thomas was the lone dissenter, signifying the rest of the court's mad dash away from his extremist position on the Second Amendment. And I saw somebody observing prior to the weekend, like, Clarence Thomas's funders are real hardcore, that they, even when you have 8 justices on the other side, they still demand receipts from him, that he stand firm on this craziness that everybody else is voting to undo in its entirety, and laying out their clear disagreement with it. And noting for the record, by the way, this is what happens when you let Justice Thomas write a majority opinion. He's going to commit you guys to something very, very stupid, and you'll be sorry you did it. Rahimi involves a violent criminal, Zaki Rahimi, who beat his girlfriend, then fired shots at either her or a witness as she fled his abuse. His girlfriend subsequently obtained a restraining order from a state court that found that he posed a credible threat to her physical safety. Rahimi, however, continued harassing her, threatened a different woman with a firearm, and was identified as a suspect in at least 5 additional shootings. Sounds like something you really kind of want to do something about, right? But we got to make it tough on ourselves. Go to the Supreme Court about this guy. When the police searched his apartment, they found a pistol, a rifle, ammunition, and a copy of the restraining order. Rahimi was indicted under a federal law that bars individuals from possessing firearms while subject to a restraining order for domestic violence. He argued that this statute violated his Second Amendment rights, like Neil Frisk. And the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, believe it or not, agreed. The court rested its analysis on New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. We keep bringing that case up. That's the one that's caused so much trouble. The Supreme Court's 2022 decision establishing a constitutional right to carry firearms in public. Thomas's opinion in Bruin, though, went much further than that specific holding, declaring that all restrictions on the right to bear arms are presumptively unconstitutional unless they have a sufficient set of, quote, historical analogs from the distant past, the founding era. He didn't bother, though, to clarify the precise era, but it seems to be sometime between, let's say 1791 and 1868. That approach posed 2 fundamental problems, which the lower courts quickly encountered when trying to apply Bruin. First, judges are not historians and cannot parse the complex and often incomplete record of this in this area with any consistency or reliability. And second, modern problems require modern solutions, especially when past bigotry prevented lawmakers from perceiving those problems in the first place. Rahimi is Exhibit A. Men were generally permitted to abuse their wives in the 18th and 19th centuries, with courts hesitant to interfere with what they deemed a private familial affair. Countless other examples have arisen in the lower courts since Bruin, with judges creating new rights to scratch the serial number off of guns or own firearms while using illegal substances. Roberts attempted to put a stop to this chaos on Friday. His Rahimi opinion cut back Bruin at every turn. Some courts, the Chief Justice wrote, have misunderstood the methodology of our recent Second Amendment cases. These precedents were not meant to suggest a law trapped in amber. Rather than hunt for perfect historical analogs, courts should ask whether the challenged regulation is consistent with the principles that underpin our regulatory tradition, whatever that means. If old laws regulated guns to address particular problems, that will be a strong indicator that contemporary laws imposing similar restrictions for similar reasons fall within a permissible category of regulations. Today's regulations should generally avoid imposing restrictions beyond what was done at the founding, but the modern law need not precisely match its historical precursors. Roberts' test significantly broadens, or perhaps loosens, the constitutional inquiry beyond what Bruin allowed. It instructs courts to look at principles, a fairly high level of generality rather than demanding a near-perfect match from centuries past. The difference between Rahimi and Bruin is perfectly captured by Roberts' majority opinion and the lone dissent written by Bruin's own author, Thomas. The Chief Justice asserted, the government offers ample evidence that the Second Amendment permits the disarmament of individuals who pose a credible threat to the physical safety of others. He breezily walked through a smattering of history, allowing for the seizure of arms to preserve, quote, public order. For proof, Roberts cited surety laws, legislation that required an individual suspected of future misbehavior to post a bond which he would forfeit if he engaged in misconduct. We actually just kind of did that to the President of the United States, didn't we? Domestic abusers could, in theory, or the ex-president, sorry. Domestic abusers could, in theory, be subject to the surety system, as could individuals who misused firearms, and that was good enough for Roberts. To him, this evidence established a historical practice of preventing individuals who threatened physical harm to others from misusing firearms, and disarming abusers fits comfortably within this tradition. To Thomas, by contrast, surety laws are worlds, not degrees, apart from the law in question, maybe, because they were civil, not criminal measures that did not actually disarm people but merely threatened them with a fine. That's actually not a bad point. These laws did not alter an individual's right to keep and bear arms, Thomas protested, and they therefore failed to establish a relevant history and tradition. Indeed, the government does not identify even a single regulation with an analogous burden and justification. He complained in dissent. In 1791, a man like Zaki Rahimi could be disarmed only after a conviction for a violent crime. And so, Thomas wrote, that must remain the rule today. Well, that doesn't actually follow, but if it were the case that that was the real methodology by which we governed, he would have a better point. But he does have a better point in terms of saying, well, maybe surety laws, not exactly the same thing as what we're talking about here. That's a better point, possibly. But yeah, why they don't ever talk about the fact that it was always the case during even the Wild West days that people were routinely required to disarm at the city boundaries. I'm not sure why that doesn't come up more often. Anyway, Bruin was a 6-3 decision, yet every justice who joined Thomas's opinion in Bruin in 2022 this time signed on to Roberts' walkback of Bruin on Friday. What happened? Well, aside from Justice Samuel Alito, every remaining member of the court expressed their views by writing or joining separate concurrences in Rahimi. Justice Brett Kavanaugh tried to defend his beloved history and tradition test, he likes that one, as opposed to a balancing test that churns out the judge's own policy beliefs, while creating more room for, quote, precedent, or the accumulated wisdom of jurists, as he puts it. Justice Amy Coney Barrett wrote that Bruin demands a wider lens than the Fifth Circuit deployed, explaining that historical regulations reveal a principle, not a mold, and do not forever lock us into late 18th century policy choices. Justice Neil Gorsuch tried to split the difference, marshaling a defense of Bruin while subtly reworking it to limit sweeping legal attacks on gun regulations. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, joined by Justice Elena Kagan, celebrated the majority's focus on principles instead of perfect analogs. History has a role to play in Second Amendment analysis, she wrote, but a rigid adherence to history, particularly history predating the inclusion of women and people of color as full members of the polity, impoverishes constitutional interpretation and hamstrings our democracy. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who joined the court soon after Bruin came down, warned that Rahimi will not end the increasingly erratic and unprincipled body of law that Bruin inspired. The blame for the lower court's struggles may lie with us, she noted, not with them. All three liberals sound ready and willing to overturn Bruin altogether if they get the chance, but will, for now, settle for Rahimi's compromise. What's next? The Supreme Court will have to vacate a spate of lower court decisions that used Bruin to strike down seemingly sensible gun safety laws, ordering a do-over in light of Rahimi. That's probably true. Some courts will gladly accept the message. Others, like the lawless Fifth Circuit, will probably interpret Thomas's dissent on Friday as the law and refuse to change their tune. Such defiance will test the majority's commitment to a more workable and balanced Second Amendment jurisprudence and likely fracture the court once more. By replacing Thomas's hardline views with a more malleable standard, SCOTUS has ended one battle over guns, but by remaining in this area, where it has no right to be in the first place, the court has invited 1,000 more. So, getting kind of uncomfortable out there. What else have we got on this case? We have two other pieces, which are of some interest here. We got something from The Nation and one from Washington Monthly. It's just interesting how this is all overlapping. This one from, where did I say we were in? The Nation, from Ellie Mistal. I never really did get the pronunciation right, but I think we all know who we're talking about here. I hope. The Supreme Court just got a gun ruling right. Good. For completely bonkers reasons. Oh no. The court's Rahimi ruling seems like a victory for gun regulation, but it is actually an attempt to pave the way for future extreme gun rulings. Ooh, that seems like a different kind of analysis. Let's add it to the pile. On Friday, the Supreme Court released its opinion in the U.S. v. Rahimi case. The case addressed whether domestic abusers, you know all about it. I just skipped that part. Let's see. Anyway, it's all a critical question whether you can disarm domestic abusers when you consider that a domestic abuser with a gun is an even more significant threat to women's health than Samuel Alito with a pen. Had to get the joke in. Anyway, in an opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts, the court ruled 8-1, people subject to a restraining order for domestic violence can lose their right to bear arms. If you stop there, as some legal commentators want to do, in furtherance of their ridiculous narrative that the Republican-controlled Supreme Court is moderate, the decision might look like a surprising victory for gun regulation, but if you actually read the opinions, concurrences, and dissents, 7 of the 9 justices offered a written opinion in this case. What you see is a group of conservatives desperately trying to square their extremist reading of the Second Amendment and their violent rulings of the past with the objective reality that domestic abusers should not be allowed to own firearms to menace their victims. The conservatives' main challenge in this respect is their own ruling in Bruin. That case, of course, in that case, the court invented a brand new standard for gun regulations, leaning hard into their favorite bankrupt legal theory, originalism. The conservatives ruled effectively that for a gun law to be constitutional in the 21st century, it needs to have been in existence, at least in principle, at the time that the Second Amendment was ratified in the 18th century. According to Bruin, 200 years of mechanical innovations to increase the killing power of armaments means nothing, nor does our society's evolving policy preference of keeping children alive and safe from gun violence. If a government wants to pass a gun regulation, it either has to find a historically analogous gun law drawn from 1791 or earlier, or we die. This, of course, is facially stupid, and I mean that in the dictionary definition of the word. Conservatives love to cite the dictionary as support for risible legal contentions that they cannot prove. So I'll use their own trick and point out that Merriam-Webster defines stupid as marked by or resulting from unreasoned thinking or acting. Already, the ruling has caused massive uncertainty and chaos. Requiring state and local governments to comb through 18th century documents to try and translate 250-year-old legal thought bubbles into modern statutory language is a fool's errand. Asking judges to determine whether they got it right is preposterous. How do they determine what analogous actually means? How much weight do they give these analogies? And how, more relevantly, do they figure out what enslavers and misogynists would have thought of a man firing a gun that has more firepower than an entire battalion of the Revolutionary Army into the air at Whataburger when his debit card was declined? That's about the size of the question there. This, in fact, is what Zaki Rahimi, the plaintiff in this case, actually did. And the question of whether he had the right to still own a gun that he had irresponsibly used in the past while under a restraining order taken out by his girlfriend is at the heart of Rahimi. Or it should be, but it's not. Instead, Rahimi is a desperate and frankly flailing attempt to give guidance to lower courts on how to apply Bruin. Roberts took the first shot at retconning Bruin to justify denying Rahimi his right to a gun. In his majority opinion, the Chief Justice argued that preventing people under restraining orders from packing heat fits comfortably alongside 18th century precedent, because our nation's firearms laws have included provisions preventing individuals who threaten physical harm to others from misusing firearms since its founding. Of course, the rub here is that Bruen doesn't just require modern gun laws to gesture vaguely back towards ancient precedent. It requires them to have a historical analog in the 18th century. So Roberts attempted to clarify that this analog need not be a historical twin or a dead ringer, which was great, except he didn't really explain how analogous a law needs to be before guns can be taken out of the hands of violent individuals. What he did do was offer two, quote, analogies, two examples of situations in which Revolutionary era folks would take away people's guns. The first example has to do with what were once known as laws of surety. These laws were passed essentially, these laws were essentially the 18th century version of paroled while out on bail, and consisted of a defendant pledging to the state not to do anything bad, and that if they did, they would forfeit a sum of money and potentially go back to prison. The second, going armed laws, involved preventing people from riding around on horses while wielding weapons if they could not be trusted to be nice to the people. I'm not making this up. My man was so tied up in knots that he's using a law originally used in ye olde England to take away swords and lances from rogue knights of the realm, to justify taking away a violent man's guns in the year of our Lord 2024. Well, you know, Roberts' historical analogies are tortured and wacky, but this is what Roberts does. He likes a law, but when he likes a law but realizes that upholding it goes against his ideological priors, he just makes stuff up. He did this with Obamacare, converting it into a tax to avoid giving the government its obvious power to regulate health care under the Commerce Clause, and he's doing it again here. Roberts is not the most moderate of the court's conservative jurists, but just the most practical. That practicality comes with a side helping of shocking intellectual dishonesty, and more people would call him out for it if he didn't occasionally come to the right conclusion through the wrong made-up reasons. As for the other conservatives, Justice Samuel Alito joined the Roberts opinion in full. Gorsuch, alleged attempt to rapist Brett Kavanaugh, oh, okay, I see, and Amy Coney Barrett, however, all wrote their own concurrences, each taking a crack at explaining why Bruen is still super awesome, even as they departed from it in this case. Gorsuch basically said that if people don't like the current conservative court's interpretation of the Second Amendment, they can repeal the Second Amendment or quit whining. I'd argue there is a third constitutionally permissible option, expanding the Supreme Court and filling it with judges who do not think that the Constitution is a murder-suicide pact. Kavanaugh treated us to a lecture on the importance of judges heeding historical precedent when deciding cases. This argument is insulting from a man who stood in front of Congress at his confirmation hearing, called Roe v. Wade settled law, and then voted to overturn it at the first available opportunity. I have exactly as much respect for Kavanaugh as Kavanaugh has for precedent. Barrett argued that the terms of the Second Amendment should not be merely ossified in what the founders thought, but that it should be more or less locked into what the founders thought as of 1791, when the amendment was ratified. She argued that laws passed after that date, even by people who wrote and ratified the Second Amendment, may themselves have gotten the Second Amendment wrong. For all three of these concurring conservatives, the ridiculous going armed and surety analogies were sufficient to get them to the right conclusion and justify their ruling in this case. But the upshot from these concurrences is that they still feel free to apply Bruen to the next gun case. And that next gun case has actually already happened. The court's decision in Garland versus Cargill, the bump stock case, was announced last week. In the bump stock case, the courts reaffirmed the violent contention that since bump stocks were not banned in the long ago past, they cannot be banned now. Taking Rahimi and Cargill together reveals a court that has not backed off its extremist interpretation of the Second Amendment, just one that was willing to ignore itself and make something up to stop domestic abusers and end an evil cavalry from having guns. The liberal justices also authored separate concurrences. One was by Sotomayor, joined by Kagan, the other by Ketanji Brown Jackson. I might be imagining it, but as I read their opinions, I noted a distinct whiff of Schadenfreude. They seemed to be having just the teensiest, tiniest bit of fun as they sat back and watched the conservatives convulse themselves over their wrong-headed precedents and happily poked holes in their tortured logic. Sotomayor and Kagan dissented in Bruen, and Sotomayor reiterated many of the reasons why, but the main thrust of her argument was to make Rahimi, not Bruen, the controlling case on the question of how analogous a law has to be to survive the conservatives. She wrote, in short, the court's interpretation permits a historical inquiry calibrated to reveal something useful and transferable to the present day. Translation, Bruen is useless, but we could work with Rahimi. Jackson was not on the court when Bruen was decided, so this was her first opportunity to dunk on that decision. The focus of her concurrence was how Bruen has proven unworkable for lower courts and unknowable for state legislatures. She wrote, the message that lower courts are sending now in Second Amendment cases could not be clearer. They say there is little method to Bruen's madness. She closed with this fantastic paragraph. Let's try and get this in. In my view, the court should also be mindful of how its legal standards are actually playing out in real life. We must remember that legislatures seeking to implement meaningful reform for their constituents while simultaneously respecting the Second Amendment are hobbled without a clear, workable test for assessing the constitutionality of their proposals, and courts, which are currently at sea when it comes to evaluating firearms legislation, need a solid anchor for grounding their constitutional pronouncements. The public, too, deserves clarity when this court interprets our Constitution. Oh, well, here, have some clarity. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
Hi, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Looks like we're going to be talking about guns for a while now, and it's important to kind of get these angles right on this stuff so that we can get a better view and a better prediction, perhaps, on how cases will come out in the future, if there's any such thing as logical consistency. And maybe this whole thing is a waste of time at this point. But I guess you can still guess politically where the justices are going to come out, but if you want to try to predict their logic, and I'm not certain that's a valuable use of anyone's time anymore, but if you wanted to, this is the type of analysis that will help you do it, I think. All right, so let's see. We were just getting through with the fantastic paragraph from Justice Jackson, although, quite honestly, it was like, yeah, it's fantastic for lawyers, but for normal people, I don't know. Not certain that it clarified anything. But then there is the lone dissent, the one vote in the 8-1 case, right, from Clarence Thomas. The fact of this dissent is significant because while the 8 other justices spent reams of paper explaining how courts should apply Bruen, they didn't listen to the man who actually wrote the majority opinion in Bruen, Thomas. Thomas forthrightly explained that his colleagues are misinterpreting his own words. Thomas writes that Bruen established that gun regulations have to have a historical precedent from the 18th century. And he writes, not a single historical regulation justifies the statute at issue in Rahimi. This might surprise some people, but I think Thomas is 100% right, at least about how to apply his own terrible reasoning from Bruen. So I think we agree on that one. Yeah, surety laws, not really a great analog, if you ask me. Thomas, not Gorsuch, and certainly not Roberts, is the one applying intellectual consistency to this issue. Sotomayor and Kagan are consistent too, because they thought Bruen was a bad ruling then and now. Thomas rightly points out that Roberts' reliance on surety laws makes no sense, as surety laws were about money and prison, not forfeiting the right to bear arms. Thomas's dissent could be summed up as, when I wrote Bruen, I didn't stutter. Again, if you roll the tape all the way back to 1791, and why would you, but let's say you do, you will find a society ruled by evil misogynist white men who thought beating their wives and girlfriends who didn't even have legal personhood was their God-given right. Domestic violence wasn't even considered illegal in this country until the 1920s. Marital rape wasn't deemed illegal until 1945. And domestic abuse of all kinds was socially acceptable and not commonly prosecuted until at least the 1970s. If we're being extremely generous to the timeline of criminalization of domestic violence, it makes no historical sense to say that people who did not even recognize domestic violence as a crime had a historical precedent of taking away guns from domestic abusers in 1791. There's no freaking analogy to be had here. The way to deal with Thomas's correct dissent is not to engage in the intellectual dishonesty practiced by Roberts. It's to repeal the Bruen ruling, which is in just 2 years, has shown itself to be unworkable and atrocious. Bruen wants us to find historical doppelgangers for any modern gun law, but the Rahimi case proves that such a focus is wrong. We know more than we did in 1791. We know that women are people entitled to human rights. We know that domestic abuse is abhorrent. We know that women are 5 times more likely to be murdered by an intimate partner if that partner has a gun. We don't need to know how an average white husband in 1791 would have thought about prohibiting gun ownership to domestic abusers, because that man died hundreds of years ago, hopefully from starvation while waiting for his battered wife to bring him a sandwich. Okay. But to admit that would be to overrule Bruen, and to overrule Bruen, conservatives would have to admit that they were wrong and that their 2-year experiment has been a legal disaster. So instead of declaring, whoops, we're sorry about Bruen, we're left with this Rahimi ruling, in which the conservatives try to prop up Bruen with new, equally unworkable logic. This is the best point so far. It was just garbage and they should have said so. All right, we make mistakes. That was not a good one. That would have been okay. This sad, stupid state of affairs will continue as long as conservatives are allowed to control the Supreme Court, and with it, our gun laws. I imagine that most of the media, which can't be bothered to read a 103-page Supreme Court ruling, will call Rahimi a step towards moderation for the conservative court. It is not. What Rahimi indicates is that the court's ruling in Bruen was legally insane, and it shows that most of the conservatives know it, but that they lack the will and strength to fix it. That is probably as good a distillation of the point as you can get out of something so convoluted. They should have simply said, the Bruen case is stupid and unworkable. The idea underlying it is stupid and unworkable. Sorry, but yeah, we did it wrong, and we can rebuild as much of this as we want, but we should do so with a clean slate. But instead, they're saying, nope, conservatives don't make mistakes. We won't call any of our brethren out. We're just not going to do it. And we come up with an imaginary standard to use to get to the results that we wanted instead. Now, who would have told you that they were going to do that? Armando. Whether he could have come up with this reasoning, he could. I guess if we had asked him, what's the dumbest way they can prop up their previous reasoning and still get to the result they want? Maybe in that thought experiment, we come up with a prediction like this, but it's awfully difficult to do because you're I don't know. I guess if you're still inclined to try to think of the Supreme Court justices as thinking logical people, then it would be very difficult to predict this. But I don't know how else you get to it. Now, all right, one more piece on the subject. Why not? We'll take a look at this from the Washington Monthly. The Supreme Court keeps misfiring on guns. In its Rahimi position, or rather opinion, the court listened to our brief as historians and upheld restrictions on domestic abusers. But it was only a tiny victory because when it comes to firearms, the justices continue to legislate from the bench, which, of course, as originalists and conservatives, they abhor. This, a piece from Holly Brewer and Laura F. Edwards, who I presume are telling the truth about who they are, that they are historians. Is there a little blurb at the bottom here? Yes, let's read that. Holly Brewer is Burke Professor of American History at the University of Maryland and author of By Birth or Consent, Children, Law, and the Anglo-American Revolution in Authority. Laura F. Edwards, the class of 1921 bicentennial professor in the history of American law and liberty in the history department at Princeton University. By the way, the more prestigious and old line the university, the longer your title as a professor has to be because they have to come up with a new thing because we already have 8,000 other endowed professors. So this is interesting. The class of 1921 bicentennial professor of history? No. History of the American law and liberty. Not history of American law? Nope. History of American law and liberty. History of American law and liberty in the law department? No. History of American law and liberty in the history department at Princeton University. Okay. Her scholarship, it's legit despite the stupidness of the title. Her scholarship focuses on legal practice in the 19th century United States. Who better to hear from on this case? I can think of no one else, but that's because I really don't know. But she sounds perfect for this. Let's look no further. In an 8-1 decision last week, the Supreme Court followed the logic of our historians' amicus brief. They probably had lots of other help in there, but they wrote this piece together to come to what should have been an obvious decision. The justices prohibited a domestic abuser who had already shot at his girlfriend and the mother of his child from possessing a gun after a judge had imposed a domestic restraining order on him. Right? Sensible. That's the thing to do in this modern world. In so doing, they upheld a federal law that the Fifth Circuit had invalidated using the court's logic in its 2022 precedent-destroying decision of New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which struck down a century-old Empire State statute limiting guns in public. Why isn't 100 years enough historical precedent for you? Because it has to be from the original framers, and no one else is ever allowed to write our laws, unless you can show that it's an exact analog for something they already did. This is a step forward, but only a tiny step. Via Bruin, the court created a crisis for state legislators and attorneys general by ruling that all gun regulations have to be rationalized through gun regulations of the founding era. In Justice Clarence Thomas's words, writing for the majority in Bruin, current firearms laws must adhere to the history and traditions of the founding, even though ours is a different era. Among other things, guns are far more powerful, accurate, and deadly. And also, this is just a stupid standard by itself. Guns are not. By that standard, every gun regulation must involve historians whose research and analysis must be evaluated by the court. While U.S. versus Rahimi vindicates historians, it also underscores the limitations of the history and tradition rule that Bruin created. Some background. Yay, more background. The conservative 5th District issued a ruling invalidating 18 U.S. Code Section 922G8, a federal statute that prohibited people under restraining orders for domestic violence from carrying guns. It construed Bruin to mean that all restrictions on gun ownership had to have an exact twin in the past. The past, moreover, was not just any moment in the past, like 100 years is not enough, right? The Fifth Circuit was unconvinced that founding era laws were echoed in the federal statute. They mean, of course, that it had to be narrowly the window during and after the Constitution's ratification in 1791. So it wasn't, there was no confounding era that echoed in the federal statute. As such, it was unconstitutional. No law could keep Zaki Rahimi from a gun. The Bruin rule that any curtailment of firearms must demonstrate that the regulation is consistent with this nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation has obvious limitations. You do not have to be a historian to see that the 1790s are not the 2020s. However, the application of Bruin's narrow history and traditions framework by federal courts has narrowed the options still further. Following Bruin, many appellate and trial courts defined history and traditions regarding legislation, namely colonial and state statutes. Yes, defined in those terms, history and tradition did not support regulation because no legislation from the founding era specifically addressed gun ownership. The Rahimi case raised the bar still higher since it involved domestic violence statutes about which founding era statutes were also silent. A view from the 18th century statutes alone suggests a lawless era. Do what you want with your guns or your wife because no statutes prohibited such behavior. This pinched view misconstrues the nation's legal history and traditions, particularly at the founding moment. Last summer, a group of historians, including us, began working on an amicus brief in Rahimi. Given our scholarship, we knew that the legal principles and practices of the founding era were about much more than the statutes and appellate opinions. Violence of all kinds, including gun and domestic violence, was regulated through widely followed principles in common law that allowed people to make complaints about threats of violence to local officials, who followed long-standing procedures to maintain, quote, the peace, which included the safety of all community members. Offenders were required to post a peace bond called a surety. Oh, this is actually in support of this standard. Very interesting. While similar to a modern restraining order, peace bonds included close community surveillance. Sureties those who posted the bond, were charged with ensuring the offender did not break the peace again. If sureties failed in their duties, they lost their part of the bond, which could mean selling productive property such as land and tools. If offenders could not find anyone to post bond, they were jailed. They were also jailed if they broke the peace while under bond. Even wives who felt threatened by their husbands could initiate this process. The constraints of coverture, which prohibited married women from prosecuting legal actions in their own names, did not apply because these were offenses against the peace of the community. That is interesting. There were extraordinary powers conferred, it seems. As our brief outlined, the regulation of violence, including gun violence and domestic violence, is part of the history and traditions of this nation. I mean, it's a dumb standard, but if we have to adhere to it, we can show that it happened. It just did not appear in the statutes. There was no need because those laws were found elsewhere in treatises, manuals for local officials, and through practices understood as legally enforceable and did not necessarily take written form. But you really have to be quite a historian to be able to find those things because you can't search it on the internet and come up with an answer, I would add. But states did expand their reach over all kinds of issues, including gun and domestic violence later in the 19th century, but the laws they enacted were not a departure from the history and traditions of the founding era. In fact, many of the initial statutes on firearms and domestic violence merely codified long-standing practices. By acknowledging this part of the nation's legal past in Rahimi, the court allowed for gun regulations for those under restraining orders for domestic violence. But it retained the myopic history and traditions test, which requires historical research to justify every gun regulation. The court kept the power it gave itself through Bruin to make law on regulating violence, even though those issues once belonged to people and their representatives. Invoking history and traditions and giving itself the authority to determine what those are, the court can pick and choose among firearms regulations. As a result, attorneys general across the country are having to find founding-era laws to justify their state's firearms regulations relating to situations and places, such as playgrounds or football stadiums, that did not exist in the 1790s, never knowing if the laws they dig up will pass muster with the court. Bruin's unclear legal standard led to confusing results. Searching through a past without clear answers, judges have suspended existing laws and rendered a hodgepodge of decisions. As Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson notes in her concurrence, the message the lower courts are sending now in Second Amendment cases could not be clearer. They say there is little method to Bruin's madness. There is general wisdom to be found in the past, to be sure, but when it comes to guns, the 1790s are not always the best place to look for specific policy recommendations. And this is an interesting thing. As I was just thinking as I'm reading through this, the role of historians here. And this is why judges are not uniquely, but probably pretty poorly suited for this job. This requires an awful lot of expertise, access to all sorts of historical information, and the ability to interpret it reasonably. And judges, A, probably don't have the time for it. B, often won't have that expertise. Some will, I guess, but you don't know who will and who won't. I mean, I guess there's some objective measure you could look and see, well, how many of these judges, maybe they can claim a historical course of study in their backgrounds. They may have been history majors. I don't know if that really qualifies you, but more so than some other courses of study, perhaps. But this, as I said, requires a certain amount of expertise. What is the expertise? It's that if you look back at the required period here, the 1790s, and you don't find a legislative history on whether it be guns or really anything else, I don't see why Clarence Thomas wouldn't also apply this to every other sort of regulation. But if you don't see it in writing, where can you find historical precedent for it? And the answer is, well, the historical record is replete with this being effectively the rule, but just an unwritten one. It's not codified, but is there evidence for it in historical writings of the time? Yes. Who will find that? Historians. How do you find it? You got to know where to go. But I don't know. Letters, correspondence of the time, actual practice of the time, court records that sometimes read out differently to us in the modern era. I'm actually thinking of, well, who was it that wrote there was a famous, celebrated episode recently in which, infamous episode recently, in which someone had written a book saying that, there was a historical precedent for the execution of people convicted of, I guess, the moral code crimes of homosexuality back in the day. And was it in England or something? And they were saying, who was it? I think I'm trying to remember offhand, and is it Naomi? Was it Wolf? Or I can't even remember which one we're thinking of here, but maybe. And let's see if I have that one correct. I'm not really certain, but I guess we could look in her Wikipedia profile and under controversies and see if that's the one. But at any rate, yeah, the result, and I guess if I can find it here, then we can get a better recitation of what the issue was. Although right now I have to climb through all of the different books and various things that she'd written in order to find this thing. But no, so far not coming up. But dang. Well, all right. So maybe I may have the name wrong, but maybe not. And I just haven't identified the episode. But the idea that she had someone had done this and poured over the historical record and had read the disposition of these cases written up in the vernacular of the time, but which to the modern eye and I guess the American eye, and these may have been English cases. I can't even recall whether that was actually the case, but it made it look like they had been somehow executed for their crimes when in fact they had the crimes against them dismissed, and she just didn't understand what the vernacular actually meant and was called out on it in a live podcast somewhere, and she was just like flummoxed, and the whole premise of the book had been undermined in this interview, and it was really odd. And I wish I remembered and better recalled exactly who was involved in this incident. Maybe you do, and maybe you're already tweeting it at me and I don't know it. But at any rate, that's a good example of how, well, you need to have some real expertise in order to recognize that this is the case and that this is what happened historically, not that other misinterpretation that could commonly be the case. Anyway, back to our organized thoughts here from the Nation. Roberts, not from the Nation, but we've moved on to, I've lost here we go, from the Washington Monthly, our Historians article. Yes, so where were we here? There is general wisdom to be found in the past, to be sure, but when it comes to guns, right, 1790, not always the best place to look for specific policy recommendations. With Rahimi, the judges still ignore the history and traditions of the nation's regulation of violence, the primacy given to legislatures and the democratic process to respond to public safety issues, except in extraordinary situations. The people and their representatives should identify and handle violence that threatens public order, not the court. The most important history and tradition is that both Bruen and Rahimi upend is the judicial humility and restraint of the time, I would add. Holly Brewer, of course, as I mentioned earlier in the piece, just reading that, once again, just to remind you, both professors of history, Holly Brewer at University of Maryland, Laura Edwards at Princeton University. We've reached the end of their article. An interesting defense of the notion by which Roberts and those conservatives who concurred with him anyway reached their conclusion that, all right, maybe the history and precedent standard set by Bruen can't be upended at this point and just thrown out. But as long as we're stuck with it, can trained historians find an analog in principle to gun restrictions in the modern era? And they find, yes, it is possible, but it is also perhaps possible that this is a stupid standard, and to the extent that it has to be executed, if executed properly, by people who aren't judges, then maybe it's a pretty bad judicial standard. Like you've written a rule here that can't properly and consistently be interpreted by federal judges. Well, who's supposed to be interpreting it? Well, federal judges. Okay, have you made a mistake then? Yeah, you have. And you should be undoing it. And that's really Ellie Mistel's point here. This is just such a bad rule that you really owe it to yourselves to throw it out and start over. So there you go. Meanwhile, here's something that we can talk about perhaps a little bit with Joan tomorrow. It's procedural in nature and congressional in nature. The New York Times covered this one before the weekend. On the House floor, Republicans gag mentions of Trump's conviction. That's the headline. The subheader tells some of the story. During official proceedings of the GOP-controlled chamber, that's the House, of course, speaking about former President Donald J. Trump's felony conviction has been forbidden, while disparaging President Biden and Democrats is routine. Yes, ordinarily, it is against the rules to speak about personalities when it comes to the president or presumably someone running as a major party nominee for president. That's true. But hey, it's been selectively enforced. Luke Broadwater lays out the situation. The floor of the House of Representatives is supposed to be a dignified place where lawmakers refer to each other as gentleman or gentle lady, speak only to the presiding officer, and never engage in personally disparaging remarks against rivals, an offense known as engaging in personalities. But what happens when the leader of one party is a convicted criminal, whom a jury has found guilty of things that would normally be considered unmentionable on the House floor? Well, the history-making felony conviction of Donald Trump has raised some historic questions for the House's rules of decorum, which have existed for centuries, but can be bent to the will of whichever party controls the majority-driven chamber. The Republicans, who now hold the majority, barely, have used those rules to impose what is essentially a gag order against talking about Trump's hush money payments to a porn actress or about the fact that he's a felon at all, notwithstanding that those assertions are no longer merely allegations, but the basics of a jury's guilty verdict. In doing so, they have declared is a violation of House rules. In short, perhaps the only place in the United States where people are barred from talking freely about Trump's crimes is the floor of what is often referred to as the People's House, where Republicans have gone so far as to erase one such mention from the official records. You know what that is, having your words taken down. In recent weeks, Republican leaders have cracked down on Democrats who refer to Trump's court cases on the floor, citing the centuries-old rules of decorum. Thomas would be happy with that, which date back to the days of Thomas Jefferson. Merely mentioning that Mr. Trump is a felon, which we do all the time, prompts an admonishment from whomever is presiding when the offending act is uttered. Trump is also indicted on felony charges, by the way, relating to his handling of classified documents and his attempt to overturn the 2020 election. The chair would remind members to refrain from engaging in personalities toward presumptive nominees for the office of the president is now a common phrase heard in the chamber after the mention of the words Trump and felon. On one occasion, Republicans barred Representative Jim McGovern, Democrat of Massachusetts, from speaking for the rest of the day and deleted his comments from the congressional record after he railed against Mr. Trump and his court cases. I won't give you the specifics necessarily, but you recognize that again as having your words taken down. Now, some other comments here. When they censor any mention of Trump's criminal convictions, they are essentially trying to ban a fact. Jamie Raskin of Maryland, top Democrat on the Oversight Committee, said in an interview, "I am not aware of any precedent where factual statements have been banned in our lifetime." Raskin said the silencing of Trump's critics on the House floor has a historical analog. So at least it's got that. The House's pre-Civil War ban on the legislation relating to the abolition of slavery. In 1836, the House passed the so-called gag rule that automatically postponed, oops, we're way behind on our music here, automatically postponed action on all petitions related to slavery without hearing them. Postponed meaning never to be taken up ever. In a legislative sense, this was, of course, far more complicated than the new rule against mentioning Trump's criminal record, Raskin said. Still, he said he considers the prohibition against criticizing Trump's felon status as Orwellian. The battle over what can be said on the House floor began last month after Mr. McGovern, the top Democrat on the Rules Committee, said on the floor that Trump, quote, is on trial for covering up hush money payments to a porn star for political gain, not to mention 3 of the criminal felony prosecutions he's facing, the other ones. Representative Jerry Carl, Republican of Alabama, and the presiding officer on the floor at the time admonished Mr. McGovern for engaging in personalities, but McGovern pressed on. And that's when Representative Aaron Hochin, Republican of Indiana, rose to demand that Mr. McGovern's words be taken down. And after a lengthy delay, while Mr. Carl figured out what to do, including consulting the parliamentarian, he reported that Mr. McGovern's words would in fact be stricken from the record. The words of the gentleman from Massachusetts accuse a presumptive nominee for the office of president of engaging in illegal activity, which he did, of course. Presumptive nominees for the office of the president are accorded the same treatment under the rules of decorum in debate as a sitting president. Meanwhile, of course, what about those rules? And has it ever prevented a Republican from engaging in personalities regarding Biden? No, and the rest of the article is dedicated...
Listening to Kagro in the morning with David Waldman.
Thank you. And as I said, it is quite properly... the rest of the article is dedicated to documenting the many, many numbers of times in which Republicans have given themselves free rein to engage in personalities so long as it's about Biden. Well, that should surprise no one, least of all Justice Putnam, who takes the wheel next with the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. We'll see you tomorrow.